Maria had been working as a maid for the Sullivan family for nearly 5 years. The Sullivans were wealthy, living in a sprawling mansion with perfectly manicured gardens and an air of elegance that Maria had grown accustomed to. Her days were filled with dusting, mopping, and ensuring that everything was in its rightful place. She enjoyed the routine and found comfort in the predictability of her work. One sunny afternoon, while tending to the garden, Maria noticed something unusual. Hidden behind a large rose bush, she spotted a black leather bag. It was out of place in the otherwise pristine garden. Curious and a bit concerned, she approached the bag cautiously. It looked expensive but was scuffed and dirty, as if it had been there for some time. Maria hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The Sullivans were not home, and the other staff were busy inside. With a deep breath, she decided to open the bag. What she found inside made her gasp and step back in horror. The bag contained a collection of old photographs, documents, and a few pieces of jewelry. The photos were the first thing that caught her eye. They were black and white, depicting scenes from what seemed to be a different era. As she flipped through them, she recognized a younger version of Mrs. Sullivan, smiling and carefree. But there were other faces too, unfamiliar ones, and they seemed to tell a different story. Among the documents, Maria found letters. They were love letters, written in a beautiful script that was unmistakably Mrs. Sullivan's handwriting. But the letters were not addressed to Mr. Sullivan. They were written to a man named Edward. Maria's heart pounded as she realized the significance of her discovery. The letters spoke of a passionate affair, plans to run away together, and then abruptly, they stopped. At the bottom of the bag, Maria found a small, velvet-lined box. Inside it was a delicate necklace, a locket with a picture of Mrs. Sullivan and Edward. The locket looked old, well-worn, as if it had been cherished and then forgotten. Maria's mind raced with questions. Why was this bag hidden in the garden? Who was Edward, and what had happened to him? She knew she needed to tell someone, but she wasn't sure who to trust. The Sullivans were influential and had a way of making problems disappear. That evening, when the family returned home, Maria's anxiety grew. She served dinner as usual, her hands trembling slightly as she poured wine and cleared plates. She couldn't stop thinking about the bag and its contents. As she worked, she noticed Mrs. Sullivan seemed distracted, her eyes distant. Finally, Maria decided she couldn't keep the secret any longer. She approached Mrs. Sullivan after dinner, her voice shaking. "Mrs. Sullivan, may I speak with you privately?" Mrs. Sullivan looked surprised but nodded, leading Maria to the study. Maria took a deep breath and recounted her discovery, showing Mrs. Sullivan the bag and its contents. As Mrs. Sullivan looked through the items, her face went pale. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the garden, behind the rose bush," Maria replied. Mrs. Sullivan sank into a chair, tears filling her eyes. She began to explain. Edward had been her first love, a passionate but forbidden romance that ended in tragedy. They had planned to elope, but he died in a car accident just days before they were supposed to leave. Heartbroken, she married Mr. Sullivan, a man chosen by her family. The bag had been a secret keepsake, something she couldn't bear to look at but couldn't throw away. It had been lost during a garden renovation years ago, and she had thought it was gone forever. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories and emotions. As Mrs. Sullivan opened up, Maria listened intently. It was clear that this revelation was both painful and cathartic for her employer. Mrs. Sullivan thanked Maria for her honesty and discretion. Over the next few days, the two women grew closer as Mrs. Sullivan shared more about her past. Maria felt a sense of relief, knowing that she had done the right thing. The secret she had uncovered was painful but ultimately healing for Mrs. Sullivan, who finally had a chance to mourn and remember her lost love. For Maria, the experience was a reminder that even in the most perfect-seeming lives, there are hidden stories and buried secrets. She returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose, grateful for the trust that Mrs. Sullivan had placed in her. And as she walked through the garden each day, she couldn't help but feel a deeper connection to the history and the lives entwined with the beautiful mansion she cared for. But the story didn't end there. One evening, Mr. Sullivan returned home earlier than usual. He had overheard bits of a conversation between Maria and his wife that sparked his curiosity. He approached Maria in the hallway, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Maria, I heard you found something in the garden," he said, his voice steady but probing. "Can you show it to me?" Maria felt a pang of nervousness. She had hoped to keep this between herself and Mrs. Sullivan, but she knew she couldn't refuse. She led Mr. Sullivan to the study, where the bag was now kept. Mrs. Sullivan was there, and her face tightened when she saw her husband. "What's going on?" Mr. Sullivan asked, looking between the two women. Mrs. Sullivan took a deep breath and explained everything, from her past with Edward to the rediscovery of the bag. Mr. Sullivan listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sat in silence for a few moments. "I had no idea," he finally said, his voice soft. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mrs. Sullivan sighed. "There was a part of my life that I thought was over. I didn't want to burden you with it." Mr. Sullivan nodded slowly, processing the information. "I understand. But secrets like this have a way of coming out eventually. I'm just glad it was Maria who found it and not someone else." In the weeks that followed, the Sullivans' marriage seemed to grow stronger. The honesty and vulnerability that had come from the revelation of the bag's contents brought them closer together. They began to talk more openly about their pasts, their fears, and their dreams. It was as if the weight of the hidden secret had lifted, allowing them to connect on a deeper level. Maria watched this transformation with a sense of satisfaction. She had played a part in bringing this family closer together, and it filled her with pride. She continued her work with renewed dedication, knowing that her role in the Sullivan household was more important than ever. One day, as she was dusting the study, Mrs. Sullivan approached her with a smile. "Maria, I've been thinking. You've been with us for a long time, and you've shown incredible loyalty and integrity. We'd like to give you a raise and more responsibilities, including overseeing the other staff." Maria's eyes widened with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm honored." As she accepted her new role, Maria reflected on how much had changed since she first found the bag in the garden. What had started as a horrifying discovery had turned into an opportunity for healing and growth for everyone involved. Maria knew that life in the Sullivan mansion would never be the same, but she also knew that it had changed for the better. For Maria, the garden would always hold a special significance. It was a place of secrets and revelations, of endings and new beginnings. And as she tended to the flowers and plants each day, she felt a deep sense of connection to the history and the people whose lives were intertwined with the beautiful mansion she called her second home. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe for more daily content. Also, I put a link down below about something very interesting. Please go check that out. See you on the next video. Bye-bye.